It is 1 minute past the hour. Harrison with you with a special update on what's going on in the Fukishima power plant. As we now know, there is a meltdown taking place in one of the reactors and thereby releasing great amounts of radiation. What's important to understand is, what does this radiation mean? What is radiation? How does it work? And what effect might it have on those of us living in the United States, indeed in the Northern Hemisphere? And let's just take 5 minutes to sort of review this and bring everybody up to speed. Of course, we're all very busy chasing Lindsay Lohan and the ghost of Osama bin Laden. But this is probably now the largest single biological medical emergency mankind has ever faced. It is now greater than Chernobyl, releasing extraordinary amounts of radiation. The Prime Minister of Japan, or the President of Japan, has offered to not take his $20,000 a year salary, saying, well, I'll go ahead and I'll take my salary once this thing is resolved. The story behind the story, of course, is instead of him just giving the $20,000 of some green technology, by not taking his salary, he also steps aside and allows TEPCO, the corporation that runs these nuclear power plants, to do whatever they want. In short, it'd be like the President of the United States saying, you know what, I'm going to waive my monthly salary in order for General Electric to, outsource to everybody. I'm not going to do anything about it, though I could if I wish to, but instead I'm just going to step aside and let the tanks roll down the Champs-Élysées while the Germans move in, and I just won't get paid for it. So that's what we're talking about. Now, we go back to 1986 when Chernobyl happened. What did the head of Russia do at that point? The very obvious thing. He realized that he needed to take military action, that it was in fact national security. The life forms, known as the people that lived there, were at stake. And so he bombed the thing, covered it in sand and boron, and entombed them in cement. We're about 2 months too late in doing that, by the way, but still it would be the best absolute choice right now, given that Greenpeace, as of today, is finding such hideously radioactive seaweed and plankton off the shores of Japan that it's right off the scale. As you know, this sort of radiation aggregates in things like green algae, these simple-celled organisms. So as this spreads through the jet stream, through the winds, one of the fallacies that we might all have is, well, it's happening over there. But Earth is one large, dynamic, swirling ball of wind. The wind that happens here will happen over there at some point. Perfect example, and an easy analogy, would be in the wintertime. It's cold in Canada. There's a cold front that comes from Canada all the way down or across wherever you are right now, and it affects you, and that originated in Canada. Air travels the entire planet. It knows no borders. It knows no boundaries. Your air is my air. This is one of the arguments for the Amazonian rainforest. If it's cut down by one particular concern or another, it's everybody's oxygen. We just don't tend to view it that way, whoever we are that might think that's a good idea. So, in fact, whatever is released into the air, what is released into the common oceans where you eat fish, where I eat fish, as the smaller fish and the plankton and such absorb this radiation, then the bigger fish eat that, and it concentrates. Then another fish eats that fish, and it concentrates. So the radiation gets stronger and stronger and stronger each being that eats it. And this, of course, is a major problem that is really hard for any of us to cope with. So it's very important. How did you like that? That was pretty exciting. It's very important to sort of understand where this comes from. Now, I'm going to share with you a lecture that the great Dr. Helen Caldicott gave just a few days ago. We know her as the mother of the anti-nuclear movement. We know her as the woman who is credited with pretty much single-handedly stopping thermonuclear weapons experimentation off the coast of Australia. For many, many years, we in this country, along with the British, were detonating nuclear weapons, particularly hydrogen bombs, even some neutron bombs, in order to test their efficacy. And one of the things, Dr. Helen Caldicott, a pediatrician by trade and a Harvard scholar and lecturer, one of the things that she did is she went to the white guys of Parliament in Australia, And she explained to them that when a nuclear bomb is tested, the fallout goes through the air, and within a couple of days, the first thing it goes for is a man's testicles. And with that, the Parliament pretty much universally and unanimously decided no more offshore testing of other countries' nuclear weapons off of Australia. And she did that. She's very smart. I call that the testicle principle because it certainly works. She also met with Ronald Reagan in the mid-1980s and pushed him toward making certain treaties against nuclear weapons. Though the supply grew under him, in many ways they became more controlled under him simultaneously. This is Helen Caldicott. So she was in Montreal a few days ago talking about what is a nuclear power plant to begin with. We all imagine falsely that a nuclear power plant actually makes electricity. That it makes electricity. Well, that's the bill of sale you've been sold. That's what I was sold. I was raised thinking, well, a nuclear power plant, it makes electricity. It makes no electricity. It makes zero electricity. It is a contained nuclear explosion 24 hours a day. So fierce, so angry, so hot that if you put water near it, the water will boil. Boiling water turns to steam, and like an 1890s locomotive that we saw crawling across the Old West, that steam turns a turbine and makes old-fashioned electricity. It grinds a turbine. That makes the electricity. The nuclear power plant does nothing but get really pissed off, having a nonstop atomic reaction inside, which gets really hot. You put water near it, the water gets hot, it boils. The steam then is drawn away from the nuclear power plant, and that pressured steam turns a crank and makes electricity. So it is a multi-billion-dollar radioactive water boiler. And Albert Einstein, whose equation, E equals mc squared, this was the formula used to be able to create the first two atomic bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy. It was his genius that created, well, some of the problems that we have. He knew, however, after he had discovered what this formula, what his hard work, what his many years in the Manhattan Project, the fruits of that labor, how they would turn out, he said never again. It became one of the greatest advocates for peace, for non-use of this technology at all, and railed against it because he knew it was complete insanity. He even said this is an insane and expensive way to boil water, and only an insane person would actually do it. Well, that kind of insanity sees 50 nuclear power plants in Japan alone, another 50 plus in France, in the United States, about 104. And these particular plants in Japan were built by General Electric. At least a handful of them were, about 75% as a matter of fact. And those same plants by General Electric happen to be here on U.S. soil. We now know by the paper of record, the New York Times, certainly not a controversial newspaper, has reported that a full third of the 104 operating nuclear power plants in the United States have failed safety tests. Now, we're not talking, what color are the light bulbs, or is the air conditioning exactly 75.3 degrees Fahrenheit? Now, we're talking major stuff like the diesel generators, the very things that were malfunctioning or not able to function at all because they had stuck them in the basement of the nuclear power plants in Japan and thereby got flooded when the tsunami came in. Those diesel generators, which are the backup electrical generators that would create the electricity that requires the million gallons of fresh water to be constantly cooling the rods, the radioactive heated rods. Well, those diesel generators in the United States, some of these nuclear power plants don't even have them. Why? Well, they sold them to nearby companies who needed diesel generators. This is the state of affairs that we now deal with here in the U.S. So let me review just very quickly in the next 5 minutes what Dr. Caldicott talked about. She doesn't make many U.S. visits, but when she does, they're extraordinary lectures and well worth seeing. You might want to Google her name, Dr. Helen Caldicott. She gave a press conference in Montreal, and it was sponsored by the Center for Research on Non-Globalization. She's involved in so many different concerns and hell-bent on not only saving little children, which is her specialty as a pediatrician, but also the grown-up children, you and me, of which we now have 7 billion on Earth, all of us, are going to be feeling the effects of the radiation coming out of Fukushima, like it or not. If you don't cover it, it doesn't exist. That's, of course, part of our media philosophy here in the U.S. The thing is, it does exist. When a tree falls in the forest, it does make noise. There may not be a human witness, but the rabbits ran, and we know that for sure. She talks about the New York Academy of Sciences, and they had done a recent report on Chernobyl, which can be downloaded, and they translated 5,000 articles, Dr. Caldicott says, from the Russian language for the first time into English, and it looks like 1 million. It looks like 1 million people have already died from Chernobyl. And this is from documents coming from Russia, translated from Russian into English for the first time. The original electricity was cut off during Chernobyl, as you remember, and the electrical supplies, which do cool water, 1 million gallons a minute to each of the 6 reactors we're looking at now in Japan. And without that cooling water, the water level will fall, and these radioactive rods then become so hot, they melt the way they did at 3 Mile Island and at Chernobyl, which is a fact of history that many people in high school are still being taught, which is kind of refreshing given today's circumstances. So the emergency diesel generators, which are as large as a house, Dr. Caldicott points out, they got destroyed by the tsunami, so there's no way to keep the water circulating in the reactors. And also on the roofs of the reactors, not within the containment vessel, are cooling pools. And the cooling pools are filled with radioactive rods, about 30 tons of the most radioactive rods you can possibly imagine, each one 12 feet long and a half-inch thick. And they give out so much radiation that if you stand next to one of these rods for a couple of minutes, it's lethal. You die. You don't croak right there on the floor, but you die slowly and hideously. Dr. Caldicott reminds us of Litvinenko, the Russian who got poisoned by polonium-9. You remember that guy, and that was part of what they believe put Vladimir Putin into the head of Russia. He knocked off the guy that was doing the inside reports on the KGB, still in full operation in Russia, and it was a real threat to Putin, who used to run the KGB. So basically it was WikiLeaks, a whistleblower, and that whistleblower died of radiation poisoning mysteriously, except now it is not so mysterious. Let's go back to Albert Einstein, the man who worked on the Manhattan Project, the man who gave us the first 2 atomic weapons that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. E equals mc squared is that energy that blows up nuclear bombs. And Einstein said that nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water. Well, it is, isn't it? It's efficient, but and that all that nuclear power is used for is to boil water through a massive heat, then turn it into steam, which turns that turbine that generates the electricity. Again, I'm reviewing a lecture that Dr. Helen Caldicott gave in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and just bringing into perspective what is a nuclear power plant and why to just sort of imagine, well, it's over there, it's happening over there, and it's a non-event event, but it really is a major event, this meltdown that we know is now happening. When you fission uranium, 200 new elements end up getting formed, and they're all much more poisonous to the body than the original uranium. Now, uranium is poisonous, period. We used to use it all the time in wristwatches, glow-in-the-dark dials, all that stuff. Had little traces of uranium in it. But we've also been using it for what we call depleted uranium, and we coat bombs that we have dropped all over Iraq from the Clinton days all the way up to the present, including in Afghanistan and other places. What this is a low-level nuclear war. This is a separate topic from what's going on at Fukishima, but understand, this is an industry. This is why we use nuclear power. It's part of the Energy Department and the Pentagon being able to articulate itself using these weapons, and you need to have a domestic use of atomic powder, of atomic power in order to keep the American people willing to pay. You pay. You pay billions for this stuff to be made. The nuclear power plants, it's not owned by somebody on Wall Street. You pay for it because Wall Street will not use investors because it's way too high risk. So you and I pay for this insanity. And having bombs coated in depleted uranium, it has a half-life of about 1 billion years or so. And as the stuff explodes and aerosolizes, it gets in people's lungs. And right now, we have a large percentage, over 60% of the children in Fallujah born without brains, without eyes. I mean, it's massive mutations. Again, not reported here, but it's extraordinary. And that's the effect of having all this uranium in the air. They're born without arms. Doctors have told the women simply to stop having babies in parts of Iraq, and the incidence of childhood cancer has gone up 12 times. Dr. Caldicott points out it's genocide, it's nuclear war being conducted in Iraq, and the uranium that they're using lasts more than 4.5 billion years with a B. So we're contaminating the cradle of civilization. As she points out, it's the coalition of the willing. In the nuclear power plants, however, whether they're here in the States, whether they're in Japan, there's a huge amount of radiation. 200 elements are formed, and some of these last only seconds. You've heard some last 8 days. When I was on the way to Japan a couple of months ago, we got to the outer islands of Hawaii, out to Hilo, and the half-life of the radioactive iodine there was 8 days. And so the highest levels in the food supply on any U.S. territories happened to be there at the time, and people were told not to eat cheese or drink milk. It was not in the popular press, but it went around word of mouth, because if you put that in the newspaper, it makes it real. And once again, it affects an industry. And Hawaii is basically one huge military base, as you know, whether it's missile tracking stations at the top of Mount Haleakala or anywhere around Pearl Harbor on Honolulu. It's a huge military-industrial complex, so naturally it's not going to be the headline in the local paper. These nuclear power plants create this huge amount of radiation, and that's why people say better take potassium iodide, and there's been a huge run on it. They now actually have a separate section for it at the pharmacy here in Los Angeles, but you don't want to just take it willy-nilly because it will affect your body, not in particularly positive ways. So don't take it yet. You take it when you absolutely need it, so that it blocks your thyroid's uptake of radioactive iodide, which is can cause thyroid cancer, particularly in children. Much older people have a much less threat, but it really is about protecting children under the age of 20. But you don't want to screw around with these sudden fixes for something that you can't measure. You can't see radiation, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. It's out there, but without proper measurement, you don't want to take the solution to something if the wrong thing is in front of you. If cesium is what you're dealing with, then the potassium iodide pills won't work. They're for the radioactive iodide only. 40% of Europe now is still radioactive from Chernobyl. 40%. Farms in Britain, lambs are so full of cesium that they cannot sell the lamb, the meat. So Dr. Helen Caldicott reminds us, don't eat European food. And 1986 was Chernobyl. This is 2011, right? And she's saying, don't eat European food. Don't eat lamb, because of this very reason, that 40% of Europe is still suffering from radiation because of the long-lasting effects. And she says it's nothing compared to what's happening now, right? Now, today. One of the most deadly nuclear byproducts is plutonium. Plutonium is named after Pluto, a great Greek god, right, who is the god of the underworld. And 1/1,000,000th of a gram, which is basically a pollen-sized speck, much as might float out of a flower's bud, one of those can give you cancer and kill you. Just a pound of the stuff, or 2 pounds of the stuff, spread evenly across the surface of planet Earth would kill every single human being on the planet. 2 pounds of plutonium, because all it takes is one pollen-sized speck to give you cancer. 2 pounds of it, theoretically spread evenly all over Earth, would kill all 7 billion human beings. And that's what this power plant in Japan, this is one of the byproducts, is plutonium. Very serious stuff. It's really important to keep an eyeball on this. God, it's just so unpleasant, isn't it? Any country that has such a reactor, the United States again has 104 of these things. They all work with uranium. The Canadians create the stuff. We buy it. We're now mining it again out of our own Grand Canyon. There was a kibosh on that for a long time under the Bush administration. Now Obama has signed off on it. We're going to open it back up for uranium. It's also important to note that if we continue with all the nuclear power plants on our planet right now, within 7 years, there will be no more uranium. There's that little of it left. And what we have to go through to get their uranium is incredibly expensive, not to mention the carbon footprint. And now you're thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm told nuclear power is clean. It's cheap. It's free. Well, the uranium, because there's so little of it left, we have to basically go through acres and acres, if not square miles, and turn up rocks and dirt and pull this stuff out. And then it has to be processed with sulfuric acid. It is a massive undertaking. And we have maybe 7 more years of uranium left to fuel these nuclear power plants, and that's it. And President Obama has already set aside $36 billion, with a B, dollars to build new nuclear power plants. I like that. The fuel of which there's not even a decade's worth. It is a major, massive, make-believe, super deadly, super dangerous. We've got 2 nuclear power plants coming up for relicensing here in California. Both, of course, are built on earthquake faults, much as Fukishima. This is a time where people in the Los Angeles area, north and south, can go and do anything in their power to impede the relicensing of these plants, so we don't get stuck with an earthquake and end up in the same place. And by the way, there's nowhere to run. Imagine being in Japan with this president of Japan saying, I've decided not to take my monthly salary or annual salary or whatever he's now jiggered that as, and in return, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to let TEPCO go crazy. How many more years or how many more months until all the islands of Japan are completely uninhabitable for the next 600 years plus? This is what we're looking at. And yes, it's grand. And yes, it's alarming. And yes, we have a nuclear power plant melting down through the containment vessel. We've never seen anything quite like this before. And it's happening. One of the reactors, number 4, is looking like it's going to collapse now. It is, again, the largest global medical problem we've ever seen. Swine flu was nothing. That was a mosquito bite for, a few hundred people. This is extraordinary. This can cause the kind of fallout that is unimaginable. Why? Why are we not sending in the Marines? And I don't mean physically. I mean with airplanes and tanks and drones. And why not just bomb this thing to smithereens, bury it in concrete, and make it go away? Why? Because it makes a declarative statement that there is an actual problem with nuclear power, which is quite obvious. But it is a multi-billion-dollar industry that you, the taxpayer, subsidize, and they, the profiteers, make a massive and amazing and gorgeous living off of, despite anybody's safety. So I just want to end and say splitting the atom is certainly a great idea, but splitting it this way and not dealing with it appropriately and allowing people to die and suffer radiation poisoning by the millions perhaps in Japan already. Remember, carcinogenesis, that is getting cancer, takes between 5 to 60 years. So by the time somebody suffers that, do they turn back and say, you know what, it was TEPCO, I'm going to sue them. Oh, they're already out of business. Now what do I do? So just a little eye-opening moment here. Didn't mean to take all your time. But I do appreciate you hanging with me, and just wanted to get a little bit of this out there before we go back to the more important stuff, that being Lindsay Lohan and all the other things that the American media excels at.